Gary Houle stared at himself in the bathroom mirror and wept. A man of only 23 years, bearing the likeness of one in his 40s. Tears streamed over the dark bags under his eyes, past his hollow cheeks, and down his waxy face that was white as marble. His mind tormented him with every excuse that he ever uttered. Clichés like, "I can quit anytime I want to," or "Everyone has at least one bad habit." But it was time for Gary to admit to himself that this wasn't just a bad habit. It was an addiction that was making him sick. An addiction that would sooner or later land him in jail, or worse yet, kill him. It wasn't until the death of his mother that he began reflecting on all of this. He loved her so dearly in life, but at her funeral, when he should have been mourning her loss, he was instead distracted by his desire to indulge in his weakness. Gary wiped the tears from his face and resolved to quit. Cold turkey. If not for his own sake, then for that of his late mother's. He left home that day, determined to be a new man. The days that followed were not at all easy for him. Food tasted like ashes. Every sound was like clapping thunder in his ears, and he would lie in bed at night, unable to sleep for fits of ague. In order to find relief from these debilitating symptoms, Gary turned to the bottle. He would purchase the cheapest whiskey he could find in the greatest quantities. Then he drank himself into unconsciousness. However, it was in this state of drunken stupor that he would find himself plagued by horrible dreams of his deceased mother. Each night, he could see her lying there in her casket, as she was at the funeral. But every night he saw her in a different state of decomposition. First, her eyes turned to jelly. Then, her nose caved into her face, leaving a gaping hole in its place. Soon, he saw her lips begin to curl and degrade, her flesh putrefy, and become a slimy yellow-green. In time, the lovely blue dress in which she was buried became discolored and fit over her withering frame loosely. Gary never found himself wanting to give in to his terrible addiction so bad as when he would wake from one of these visceral dreams. Then he would often just lie in one place and stare at the ceiling while he assured himself of his strength to endure. 6 weeks into his resolve, and while still early in the morning, Gary was called into his supervisor's office at work. He asked Gary if he had been drinking on the job. Gary lied and told him that he had not. The man stood up, sauntered over to Gary, put his hand on his shoulder, and without so much the courtesy of looking him in the eyes while he spoke, he told Gary he was fired. For one fleeting moment, Gary thought about protesting, even begging for another chance. But he decided he didn't care enough to lower himself to that. Instead, Gary rose from his seat, teetered a little where he stood, and told his former supervisor to go to hell before he left that factory where he had worked for last 4 years. That night, Gary's phone rang for the first time in over a month. He looked at it as it continued to ring. It was his sister calling. He let it go to voicemail while he finished what whiskey he had left, drinking it straight from the bottle. It was almost midnight when he collapsed on top of his bed and decided to listen to the message his sister left for him. "Hi, Gary. It's Gina. I was just calling to see how you were holding up. Tomorrow is going to mark 2 months since Mom." Here, there was a long pause. "I'm going to visit her grave tomorrow morning. Maybe afterwards, I can take you out for lunch or something. I hope you're doing all right. I know you were really close to Mom, despite her sickness. Just call me, okay? Let me know. You have my number. Call me. I love you." After listening to the message, Gary deleted it. When Gina found out about their mother's addiction, she completely turned her back on her. She should have shown the poor woman pity. She left home and begged Gary to do the same, but he refused. Like a good son, he chose to stay by his mother's side. Then, too, he had to convince Gina not to call the cops on their mother when she found out about it. But only now, after she was dead, was Gina going to go out of her way to visit her. Now, she had some nerve. Gary's anger renewed his energy and sobered him a little. He knew he wouldn't find sleep. So he rose from his bed and stumbled from his bedroom to his front door. He decided he would go for a walk. His mind swam with dark thoughts. The nerve of his supervisor, the nerve of his sister. He could have spit. Gary breathed the night air deep into his lungs. He thought all about his despair. He meditated on how he had never been so miserable in all of his life. He questioned why he was even trying to overcome his habit if life was worse off without it than ever he was with it. Gary stomped down the road, determined now by two things. He was going to visit his mother, and he was going to give up his foolish endeavor to keep free from his so-called addiction. If she were alive, his mother would understand. After all, she too shared the exact same habit. He wouldn't have ever started if it wasn't for her. Wasn't it she who gave Gary his first taste? Shortly after the passing of his father, Gina was too much of a prude and a coward to have any herself. But not him. He gladly accepted his mother's offering. Of course, Gina didn't know that, nor did she need to. It was none of her business. He smiled to himself, eager to finally partake once. Again. Hours had passed. Gary woke around 5 o'clock in the evening. His head felt like someone had driven railroad spikes into his skull, an after effect of the cheap whiskey he drowned himself in the night before. His mind was still cloudy after waking. He couldn't think of where he was or how he had gotten there, but he was covered in mud, and there was a film on his tongue and a lingering taste in his mouth that told him he had given in to his addiction. Strangely, he did not feel ashamed. Rather, there was a sense of relief that washed over him, and what felt like a great weight lifted from his entire being. But as he looked around, new anxiety washed over him when he realized where he was. It was a holding cell at the county jail. That's when the memories of what had transpired returned to him. He remembered walking to the cemetery, shovel in hand, and how it took him well after sunrise to finish digging into his mother's grave. Perhaps it took another quarter of an hour or so to break open her casket. He remembered the smell of her decomposing body pouring out of that box. He unconsciously smiled as he recalled his sister discovering him down in that hole, tearing strips of their mother's rotting flesh away from her bones like a starved animal might. He remembered the sound of her scream and the smile it brought to his face. But now he was jailed. He knew that he would likely be so for a very long time. How could he acquire what he craved under state supervision? When he first consumed the putrefied flesh of his father, he was hooked. Since then, before she passed, both he and his mother had exhumed and eaten many other cadavers too. But when she died, he didn't want his hunger to fall upon her. But still, he was sure she'd understand, maybe even approve. This thought comforted him, and if she was his last, he thought he could be content with that. He laid back down on the narrow cot, folded his arms behind his head, closed his eyes, and went to sleep. The Wilkins family had never been the outdoorsy type, but after Mike's recent affair that shook their 20-year marriage to its core, he insisted that a camping trip on the Appalachian Trail would help them reconnect. Claire wasn't convinced. She hadn't forgiven him for what he did. He'd betrayed her trust, sleeping with his secretary, and no amount of "I'm sorry" could take away the sting. Still, for the sake of their kids, 10-year-old Jake, who still idolized Mike, and 16-year-old Emma, who understood far more than anyone wanted to admit, she reluctantly agreed. Mike believed the camping trip would be the perfect way to patch things up, but Claire didn't buy it. This trip wasn't a solution. It was an attempt to run away from the damage they had caused. A change of scenery to distract from the pain still lingering. She knew it, and Mike probably did too. But for the kids, she would try. They arrived late in the afternoon, the dense fog of the Appalachian hills already rolling in, casting an eerie pall over the landscape. Claire shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat as Mike parked their car, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tight. He wasn't a camper, neither was she, but he kept trying to make it sound like they could be reconnected by simply being in nature. "Let's just get this tent set up," Mike said, brushing off the cold October air. "We'll do a quick hike after dinner, get the kids some exercise." Claire glanced over at Emma, who had her earbuds in and her phone clutched tightly. Emma was usually angry with her father, but there was something different in the air today. Her daughter had grown quiet over the past few months, a new layer of bitterness there that Claire couldn't quite explain. Emma was an expert at keeping her feelings hidden, but Claire could sense her frustration. "Emma," Claire called softly, "can you help me set up the tent?" Emma didn't respond at first, just scrolled through her phone like Claire wasn't speaking to her at all. Claire sighed, but then Emma's gaze flickered up, her eyes cool and detached. "I'm fine. Just let me finish texting." Claire nodded. "Right." Jake, on the other hand, was thrilled to be outdoors. "Dad, can I help with the fire?" he asked eagerly. Mike shot him a proud smile, ruffling his hair. "Of course, buddy. Get the kindling, and I'll get the bigger logs." Claire couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. Jake was so eager to please, so ready to earn his father's approval. But Emma had stopped seeking Mike's approval long ago. As they set up camp, Mike and Jake worked together, building a small fire, while Claire helped unpack the rest of their gear. Her thoughts kept returning to Emma, to the way she'd shut down ever since the affair. It wasn't just the usual teenage angst. It was something deeper, something Claire wasn't sure how to fix. When they sat down to eat, Emma barely looked up from her phone. She poked at her food, her usual teenage disinterest obvious. "Emma, can't you give it a try? Have some fun?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice light. Emma shrugged without meeting her mother's eyes. "It's fine. I'm just not hungry." "Why don't you put the phone away for a bit?" Mike said. His tone clipped. "We're here to spend time together." Emma's gaze flicked toward him, but she didn't respond. She didn't have to. The tension between her and Mike was palpable. He was trying, sure, but Emma was too smart to be fooled. She knew exactly why they were here, and it wasn't to reconnect. It was to bury the past. The morning came too quickly, with the sounds of the forest outside filling their tent. Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the birds and the rustle of leaves. There was a sense of quiet desperation about the whole trip. It wasn't going the way Mike hoped. And Claire, she was just going through the motions. After breakfast, they hiked deeper into the woods. Jake practically bounced along the trail, eyes wide as he explored every rock, every stick. He tried to tell Mike every little thing he noticed, hoping for approval. "Dad, look, I think I found a deer track." Jake pointed to the ground excitedly, his voice high-pitched with joy. Mike smiled, kneeling next to him to inspect. "Nice work, buddy. That's some good observation." Claire watched them, feeling a pang in her chest. Why couldn't Mike see how hard Emma tried too? But Emma wasn't the type to beg for attention. She was just angry. But why? "Mom, do you think we'll see any bears?" Jake asked, running back to Claire's side. Claire forced a smile. "Probably not. Bears stay away from people. But let's be careful, just in case." As they walked deeper into the woods, Claire kept noticing how quiet Emma was. She wasn't texting, wasn't complaining. She just walked. The tension between them was thick, suffocating, but Emma wasn't saying anything. As they made their way back to camp, Claire tried to engage Emma again. "You okay?" Emma gave her a tight smile, her eyes distant. "Yeah, fine." But Claire knew better. Fine wasn't the word to describe what was simmering under the surface. The unspoken anger was so much more than what could be expressed in a few words. That night, Claire stayed awake longer than usual. The sounds of the forest felt off. Too quiet, too still. She heard the wind rustling the trees, but there was something else beneath it. Something that didn't belong. By the third morning, the unease was unbearable. Claire could feel it in her bones. The isolation, the stillness of the woods, made the world feel a little too empty. It started with small things that morning. A pair of larger tracks that looked similar to large footprints near the camp that didn't belong to any of them. Camp chairs moved slightly from where they had been left previously. After a day on the trail, The family returned to their camp to find a foreboding message. Scrawled in the ashes of their campfire the night before were the word, "Run, rabbit, run." Mike waved it off. "Probably some hikers trying to mess with us. There's nothing to worry about." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Someone was watching them. Later that afternoon, while they hiked, Claire tried to talk to Emma again. She found her daughter off to the side, looking more withdrawn than ever, her face shadowed with something Claire couldn't quite place. "Emma, talk to me. Please. You've been so distant lately." Emma stiffened, her gaze flicking toward her mother. "I'm fine, Mom. Stop trying to fix everything. You can't. You don't get it." "Get what?" Claire's voice cracked with frustration. "You and Dad. You think everything's going to go back to normal. But it's not. It's not normal anymore." The words hit Claire harder than she expected. She didn't know how to respond. Mike had tried to pretend things were fine, but Emma saw through him. She had seen everything. She knew about the affair, knew about the lies. And Claire, she felt like she was the only one who didn't know how to fix this. That night, Claire had a dream unlike any other. The forest around her was bathed in moonlight, but the trees were twisted, their trunks gnarled and deformed. A deep, unnatural chill hung in the air, and the silence was suffocating. Claire felt a presence behind her, a shadow stalking her every move. She turned, but there was nothing there, except the sound of rustling branches and the slow, deliberate creak of something moving toward her. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape too unnatural to be human. Its eyes, hollow, sunken, black as midnight, locked onto hers, and a chill shot down her spine. "Run," it whispered in a voice that felt like it was coming from inside her own mind. "They always run, Claire." She tried to scream, but no sound came. The creature's long, spindly fingers reached toward her, and just as it touched her, the ground beneath her feet gave way, plunging her into darkness. Claire woke with a start, gasping for air, her body slick with sweat. The darkness of the tent felt heavy, suffocating. She quickly sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream had felt too real, the terror too tangible. Here's a revised version with a more gradual reveal of the creature and Claire's reaction to discovering the marks on the tent canvas, along with Mike's attempt to rationalize the situation. Shaking off the lingering dread from her dream, Claire tried to settle herself, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She turned over, but then her eyes widened as she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The corner of the tent where the canvas met the ground. There, faint but unmistakable, were deep, jagged claw marks, long and cruel. The scratches marred the surface as if something had raked its claws across the fabric, leaving behind unmistakable gouges. Claire's heart skipped. She was sure they hadn't been there before. The marks hadn't been there when they set up camp. Something had been here. Her breath hitched as she scanned the night around them, the sounds of the forest now unnervingly distant. Was it just her imagination, or had the air turned even colder? She sat up quickly, trying to steady her shaking hands. She didn't want to wake Mike. Not yet, not while she was still trying to piece together the strangeness of it all. But the doubt clawed at her, the unsettling sense that someone, was lurking just beyond the trees. It wasn't just the unease she had been feeling all day. This was something different, something real. Tentatively, she unzipped the flap of the tent, careful not to wake Emma or Jake. She crept outside, her breath visible in the air. The campfire's embers were low, casting strange shadows on the ground. As Claire looked around, every tree and bush felt like it was watching her, the hairs on her neck standing at attention. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides. She walked a few steps away from the tent, glancing around the perimeter. Her eyes scanned the trees, the underbrush, the shadows. She felt the weight of the silence pressing in, suffocating. Suddenly, a rustling sound, a soft snap of a twig, made her freeze. Her body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. Was it an animal? The wind? Mike? She whispered hoarsely, but the sound of her voice only made the silence feel more oppressive. She took another step forward, then froze again. There, in the distance, a figure, tall, too tall, slipping between the trees, just out of clear view. Her breath quickened. She backed up toward the tent, heart pounding, but the figure never came closer. It was just there. She could feel its presence, like a weight in the air. She rushed back to the tent, unzipped the flap, and crawled in, trying to steady herself. She tried to wake Mike quietly, but he stirred before she could even speak. "What's wrong?" He muttered sleepily. Mike, I found something." Her voice was shaky as she looked back toward the entrance, her gaze flickering nervously. "There are marks on the tent. Something's been here." Mike blinked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Marks? What are you talking about?" Claire's voice trembled. "Claw marks, Mike. Big ones, deep ones. They weren't there earlier. Something was outside the tent." Mike sat up, running a hand over his face. He wasn't fully awake yet, his brain foggy with sleep. All right. Let me check it out. Stay here, okay?" Claire nodded, but her eyes followed him as he stepped outside, looking around the camp. She held her breath, praying he'd find something that would make sense of the fear clawing at her. Mike circled the camp, inspecting the ground, the trees, even the fire pit. When he returned, he had the same skeptical look he always wore when something seemed off. Nothing, no signs of anything, just some disturbed dirt around the fire. "You probably just imagined it, Claire. We're in the woods. Animals mess with stuff sometimes." But Claire wasn't convinced. "You didn't see anything unusual out there?" She pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike hesitated, looking past her, out into the woods, as if the quiet was starting to settle on him too. "No, nothing I haven't seen before." Still, Claire couldn't shake the feeling in her chest, the sense that something was out there, watching them, waiting. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but sleep didn't come easy for Claire. She could feel it. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck never lay flat. She stayed awake, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, waiting for something. The wind rustling the leaves, the odd snap of a branch, the whisper of a voice that sounded like her own. By the fourth day, Claire knew something was wrong. The sense of unease had only deepened overnight. The tension between her family had been replaced by a creeping dread, whispers, knocks on the tent at odd hours, strange noises in the trees, and a bone-deep feeling of being followed. It all culminated in a suffocating moment, when they realized that they were no longer alone. When the creature revealed itself, Claire was already bracing for the worst. It appeared in the trees, its figure gaunt, unnaturally tall, its features too sharp and too still to be human. The forest around it seemed to warp, the shadows elongating, bending with its presence. Claire froze, her heart slamming in her chest. There was no mistaking it. This was no wild animal. This was something far darker, far older. She could feel Emma's hand trembling in hers as they stood, rooted to the spot. Emma's eyes were wide with terror, but Claire held on, trying to anchor them both to reality. They had to get out. But the creature wasn't after Emma or Jake. It was after Claire. She could see it in the hollow eyes, eyes that were fixed only on her. It wanted her, and Emma and Jake. They were simply running for their lives. The creature spoke, and Claire's blood ran cold as its voice, distorted and twisted, echoed in her ears. It was her voice, twisted into something monstrous. "Run! Run now!" Chaos erupted. Mike, believing he had just heard his wife shout a command, grabbed Jake and Emma, pulling them toward the path they had come from. But Claire stood still, her feet heavy as stone. She knew what was coming. There was no escape from this thing. She wasn't going anywhere. With one final look at her children, Claire closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Mike managed to get his family back to the CRV, but as they hurried away, he suddenly realized Claire wasn't with them. He turned, looking frantically for her. She wasn't in step with them, wasn't even in sight. About 10 yards from the family SUV, Mike stopped dead. He stared at the windshield. Written in blood was a message that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They always run.